So it is 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that means that it's 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and that means it's 5 p.m. GMT. And we have our friend Rami Essides back with us from Distill Networks. Rami, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Max. How are you?
Excellent. Good deal. Well, Rami is the one of the world's leading, if not leading, bot expert. And if anyone knows about bots, it's Rami and Distill Networks. And we've put a really, or rather, Rami's put a really good, in essence, class or a course, really, right? That kind of goes through the problems that exist out there, in particular, as they relate to the sort of retail space and travel space and various solutions that are out there. And of course, I'm sure he's going to talk about what he does in particular. So, enough from me, Rami. Take it away. If you want to pull up your slide deck there, we'll get going.
Sure, thanks, Max. So we're here to talk a little bit today about understanding potential bot attacks and what you can do to prevent them. Um, it's really important first to explain what a bot is, and a lot of people have a misconception of a bot. They think of a bot as just malware that's running on your computer. But there's a lot of different kinds of bots that exist out there in the world. There are those that are malware that are embedded in computers. There are those that are purpose-built, that are running in the cloud on hosted environments. There's legitimate bots like Google and Bing and Yahoo that are out there helping index the web. So a bot is really just any kind of computer software that automates a task over the internet or on your computer. Generally, a bot is bad when it starts mimicking the behavior of a real person, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Is what are the different ways that it can mimic a real person, and how do we identify that, and how do we prevent that? So to make it simple, we've lumped them into three types of actions that these bots are taking. One is the theft bot. A theft bot is a computer program that's written to steal data, steal content, or steal pricing information. It's a web scraper that takes your content and plagiarizes it on another website. It's a price scraping bot that goes out to the web and harvests your pricing data and sells it to your competitors so that they have a competitive advantage about your price sheet. Or it's a data aggregation bot that goes out there and aggregates several different data sources together, and by doing so becomes more valuable than the sum of the parts, all without paying for it. And that's the critical part. These bots are doing this without your consent. If you wanted this to happen, then an API would be the right way to get that information out to the third parties, but these bots are stealing it without your knowledge. Creative America estimates that about over $5 billion are stolen by theft bots from digital publishers online. There are 17 multi-million-dollar lawsuits that happened last year that are just related to the theft of data. So this is a huge pervasive problem, the theft of information from bots. The next thing that could happen is fraud. Again, we think about the online ecosystem is built to generate leads, generate clicks of real people. But if you can create a computer program or a bot to do the same thing a real person can do, then you can aim that to and leverage that to make a lot of money. So that's what click fraud is. Click fraud is creating a computer program that falsifies clicks to an advertising campaign. This can be used to rack up dollars for your competitors so that it wastes their advertising dollar, and there's companies that are built around doing this. Or it can be somebody that's just trying to rack up money for their own sites. So if you're buying ads from an ad exchange, you don't know where the different inventory is coming from. You're just bidding on it in real time, and you may not be sure if the site that you're getting it from is just trying to boost their numbers by 30% by using bots, or if it's 100% fraud or 0% fraud. It's amazing how much fraud exists in the ad ecosystem. Then there's form fraud. I think if you have a comment form online, you've probably been spammed before. Sometimes you're just you're spammed because they're trying to share a message. Sometimes it's actual form fraud where they're trying to game some sort of incentivized program. So if you think of lead generation programs, or if you think about affiliate programs that get compensated on form submissions, form submission bots are a huge fraud angle. Now, Adweek says that click fraud alone is over a $6 billion problem. When we talk about click fraud and how does it hurt the advertising community, it's $6 billion that's going to waste to these organized crime units. So that in itself is a huge problem. And then the final aspect of the bots is a security piece, and this is where the Chief Information Security Officer of your company should be aware. We're calling it Breachbot, and it's really a couple of different flavors that the vector of attack can come from. One is just somebody doing vulnerability scans against your site. In fact, your organization is probably already doing this against themselves. They're looking constantly, using automated computer programs to see if they're vulnerable to attack. The problem is the bad guys are doing the exact same thing. So if everybody's watching you, waiting for you to accidentally release some code that is flawed, or uncover a zero-day threat that just gets exposed, you may know about it at the same time because both internally and you and the bad guys are running the same vulnerability scans. The problem is you're not going to be able to patch it that quickly. They will be able to attack you in no time at all if they're running these vulnerability scans on you. So it's not just enough to have your own internal vulnerability scan watching your site to make sure that your developers don't accidentally release bad code or you're not vulnerable to new attacks, but it's also important to make sure that other vulnerability scanners aren't running against you. The biggest example I give about this is when there was the OpenSSL bug. The bug came out and everybody knew about it, but it took people days, if not weeks, to patch it. And we could identify very easily which sites are vulnerable to it. The problem was, so could the bad guys, and so they took a lot of advantage of that in that couple of week gap while people were still rushing to and scrambling to patch their systems. So make sure that not only are you doing vulnerability scans against yourself internally, but also preventing vulnerability scans from running against you. Brute force login attempts is a new threat that I think is just now emerging for people. They don't recognize this because it's not you individually getting hacked, it's somebody else getting hacked and you being the byproduct of that. And what I mean by that is, if somebody else gets hacked and their username and password list gets compromised, then that's not really you being hacked, but what organized crime has started to do is to take those usernames and passwords and then try them on a lot of different sites. And unfortunately, most people don't use unique passwords across their web visits. They use the same email and password login to get into all sorts of different places. I used to be victim of this. I used to be lazy and only have one password. Over time, I learned to stop doing this. So when you think about brute force login attempts, it's just somebody taking an email and password list and trying to see if it works. In the millions of combinations, I'm sure some will. And what happens if they get behind your perimeter is that they can clean out any assets that your customer has behind there. So if you're a ticketing site, or if you're a bank, then they could easily get behind that login wall and they can empty out any assets. And so anytime that you have risk there of even stored credit cards, they can make purchases and send them to an alternate address. All those things exist in case in that brute force login attempt. The biggest example of this is that it happened to Namecheap, one of the world's largest registrar, a couple weeks ago. Namecheap had 30,000 accounts compromised before they realized that what was happening, and they very quickly reacted, reset passwords. But the only reason they knew that it was happening is because it was happening at such a large scale that their system started detecting it. You need to be able to catch the needle in the haystack, because one account being cleaned out is not okay, let alone 30,000. And I think everybody knows and recognizes denial of service attacks. DDoS attacks are prevalent, they take your site offline, and they come in both application level DDoS attack and just brute force attacks. And this is a small vector of a bot. DDoS attacks are automated computer programs that are run in massive scale to take down your website. So with all of these different types of bots, what can you do? You can wait for Congress to act. They tried doing some measures of things with PIPA and SOPA, and they've tried to do things with legislation, but they're slow moving. This is the do nothing Congress, and I think we can all agree that waiting for legislation to happen, well, you shouldn't hold your breath. You can take your own legal action. You can go out there and proactively sue the bad guys. But when you're suing somebody, that means that the damage has been done. That means that they've gotten into your systems, or they've gotten the data that you hold so near and dear. And so this is reactive and very, very expensive. There's no guarantee that you'll win, although court precedent has shown that it is illegal. But by the time you sue them, the damage has pretty much been done. You can do something in-house, and then we're about to talk about some of the in-house solutions that are available out there. And taking a technological approach, I want to say, is probably your best bet. Whether you do things in-house or you subscribe to a service like Distill Networks that uses that turns it into a software as a service, it's important to take a technological approach as opposed to the other two options. So the first thing that most people do is monitoring web logs and then blocking the malicious IP addresses that they see. If you think about it, what you do is you use some sort of log management tool, or you look at the logs manually, you dissect them, and you look for patterns. You look for IPs that are using a large amount of requests, or using a large amount of your computing and resources, that IPs that come from places that you've never heard of, or places that you don't have a customer base. Very easy to start picking out some of the really worst case offenders. But the problem is it's still reactive. You're doing a post-mortem search, and you're often trying to block blocks of IPs where it's a mix of real people and bots, and so it's a very blunt tool. It's also dangerous because bots oftentimes rotate through their IPs. So when a bot owns an IP for one period of time, it may not be the same IP that it owns the next 24 hours, and that IP may be sent off to a legitimate user. So you get in this dangerous game of blocking legitimate users, and you're doing so reactively. Plus, it's very, very intensive to go through and actually find each of those bots. Another thing that you can do is a little bit better. It's a little bit more autonomous, which is rate limiting. And you can do this with an application level script that you write, or you can do this at your CDN or web application firewall layer. And so essentially you identify, what is a legitimate user really going to do on my site? How many pages are they legitimately going to look at? And then you say any velocity higher than expected, we're going to block. And that's, again, great for blocking the really egregious bots. But what happens traditionally is that the bots identify where that choke point is, where your threshold is, and then they throttle back to make sure that they stay under that threshold. It's also a little dangerous to block based on IP, because you often have situations where a large group of users are sharing one IP. So if you're a travel site and you do rate limiting on one IP, but that IP happens to be a university, you could potentially view 1,000 different users doing 1,000 different requests as one person being malicious, and that could be dangerous. It's better, if you're going to do any kind of rate limiting, to do it based on sessions, cookies, or some sort of individualized fingerprint. Finally, you can do CAPTCHAs. And I think CAPTCHA, by the way, stands for, nobody knows what CAPTCHA stands for. CAPTCHA stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test to Tell Computers and Humans Apart. It's a mouthful, but it's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell a real person from a human. a real person from a bot. And the concept of a Turing test is fantastic to be able to distinguish the two. The problem with CAPTCHAs is that they're very annoying. In fact, they actually cause a loss in conversions if you have them on a web form, if you have them on some sort of sales funnel. It's been proven that they lead to a loss of conversions. Plus, you can't put a CAPTCHA on every single page. That would annoy the heck out of your users. I think the worst thing is, out of all of that, though, is that CAPTCHAs have a complete nemesis. They have tools out there that have real people solving CAPTCHAs for bots. One of the tools is death by CAPTCHA, where it literally is a call center that receives instructions from a bot in a screenshot, and then they respond back with the answer to the CAPTCHA. So CAPTCHAs are not a secure way to stop bots, and at the end of the day, they annoy the heck out of your users. I'm running a little low on time, so I'm going to briefly talk about some of the approaches that we've taken at Distill Networks that make us unique, things that you might be able to adapt internally to improve your own systems, or make you consider examining or looking at an automated system like Distill. One of the things that I mentioned is we use a fingerprint as opposed to an IP address, and that allows us to get a lot more granular in terms of identifying the real a bot versus a real person, so that we don't have those false positives. We like to think that we're proactive as opposed to reactive, and some of the ways that we do that are first validating the identity of every single person that comes through our system. So that means that they're not spoofing their IP address, that means they're not spoofing their user agent, and they're not running any kind of malicious software and coming in. It's a very quick check, but it's a check that's important to make. Otherwise, you can very easily disguise or masquerade who you are. If you say you're Googlebot, we want to validate that you are actually Googlebot. We also make sure that there's no automation software that's running in the browser, that's running as pretending to be the browser. So things like Selenium, Ruby, Water, .NET, all of those things can automate real browsers. There could be malware that's embedded in the real browsers. All of those things we look for, and we make sure that you're clean before we let you into the site. That's a proactive approach as opposed to waiting for them to do something bad. We also harden your website. We're going to randomize the elements on the page. We're going to insert hidden code, hidden honeypot links, hidden form elements, and we're going to change up the CSS of the page in a transparent way, but in a way that makes it very hard for bots to keep up with. If you're fundamentally randomizing the code on the site, it makes it that much harder for the bot to keep up on what's happening, because the site becomes a lot more dynamic. And the most important piece is the behavioral modeling. We look at what your normal traffic pattern is supposed to look like and find behavioral anomalies to that. Fundamentally, this is the hardest thing to fake as a bot, because bots don't know what your real traffic is supposed to look like. Bots, we found, are either very, very systematic or very, very erratic, and both of which fall outside of the norm. This goes well beyond rate limiting to correlating things like who owns the IP, what time of day are they coming in, how many pages do they look at, absolutely, but what is their trend, what is their navigation path? Correlating all of those bits of information together into a decision is a lot more powerful, and that's I think where Distill really excels. And just so you guys know, we sit in line. Anything that you have to do has to be done before it hits the web server. By the time a bot gets to your web server, it's already too late. So whether you use Distill or you use anything else, make sure that you use something that can intercept the malicious bots before they get there. And talking a little bit about our deployment options, and we also have a lot of reports that come with this, understanding not just that we can block the bots, but understanding who was it that attacked you and why is really important to harden your systems. If we can help you identify that a specific page was vulnerable or a specific account was breached, that's a lot more important than just saying that we were able to block 1 million bots for you. So the reporting aspect is just as important as the blocking. And that's really it for today. I'll pop back over, Max.
Rami, as ever, thank you very, very much. Lots of content there, and just to remind everyone to submit the questions through the IM on the page. I've got a question here that came in. It's actually quite interesting. Can bots scan the deep web, or can they only operate in the HTTP protocol?
No, they can actually, bots run on all sorts of different protocols, and it's a really great question. What's interesting is if you open up an IP on the web, if you put a server on an IP and never broadcast that IP out anywhere, just put it on a blank IP that's not linked to anything at all, and just listen on the entire stack of ports, you're going to find that bots are attempting SSH logins, bots are attempting Telnet. Pretty soon, if you have a WordPress site, bots somehow figure out that this is a WordPress site and try looking for WordPress vulnerabilities. Bots are scanning the entire web, all of IP space, and looking for any kind of entry point in. And it's really pretty impressive the scale at which all of these bots operate. And yeah, that's a great question. It's scanning the entire web, not just HTTP protocols.
Okay. Another question. I mean, you covered it, but let's just go back into it. How effective are firewalls? In all honesty, that's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So firewalls are great at setting boundaries. That sets very hard lines that you can or can't cross this port. You can or can't come in if you have this IP. The problem is bots are very, very dynamic. So in the landscape of bot threats, firewalls are not very effective. Firewalls are effective at keeping people out of places that nobody should be allowed in. But in terms of determining a real person versus a computer program, letting some people in but not letting others in, firewalls don't have that dynamic ability to be able to react that way.
Okay. Questions here come in. How do I know if my website is vulnerable to these bot attacks? Are there signs I should look for?
So unfortunately right now, the things that you can do are looking at your logs to see if this is happening. We offer a free trial, so a lot of people just use us to see what kind of bot traffic exists and then make an educated decision on whether or not they need to take some sort of action. So you can always put your website on Distill for free to see what's happening before you actually take any course of action.
Sounds good. I'm actually going to send off after this hangout. I'm going to send out an email to everyone that registered, and I'll add your free trial link in there as well. Okay.
Cool.
Is another question here is there a trend you normally see with bots on websites, a percentage of bad bots, or is it worse on some sites than others?
Yeah, so it really depends on the vertical of what they're what your vertical is and what they're trying to do with your site. Overall, as an overall percentage of traffic, we're seeing anywhere from 30 to 50% being malicious bad bots. For that's just about any website out there. Now, what they're trying to do, the trends of what they're trying to do, really depends on your vertical. For example, if it's e-commerce, they're using a technique called carding to try fake credit cards. They're trying to log into your shopping cart and behind your customer accounts, and they're trying to get your pricing data. If you're a digital publisher, they're trying to get your content. Same with an online data company. If you're a bank, they're really just trying to penetrate and look for vulnerabilities. So it depends on what you are, and that's why they're coming at you. But as an overall trend, yeah, 30 to 50% of your website traffic will be bots.
Okay, Ram, I'm just asking these questions as they come in. So if you've covered the material, it's just people are still, in just weaving back in and out, and people got questions. So it goes here: how do you ensure that actual users or customers aren't being blocked from my website?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that we like to do, and it's I think a great strategy whether you use us or use somebody else, is that instead of taking a hard blocking action if you're not sure if it's a bot, then challenge them with a Turing test. So there are some things that we do that are absolutely binary. We're 100% sure that this is a bot. And in those cases, we tell our customers just go ahead and block them outright. But for situations that we're maybe 99% sure, specifically around behavioral modeling, you can never be 100% sure. And what we do is we introduce Turing tests, and we talked about this with CAPTCHAs, but there are other Turing tests that you can introduce that don't put a hard block on somebody, but validate that they're a real person. So we actually have our support staff interact with them. They get a pop-up that says, hey, we think that something's going on, interact with us, or validate your email address. Those types of things are Turing tests that are less invasive and actually more stable, more secure than CAPTCHAs.
Mhm.
What's really interesting is anytime you do that, then you feed that back into the mechanism of which you detected that person. React to that. Don't just say, okay, well, false positive, let them through. False positive, and make sure you go back and adjust your algorithm so that you don't cause that false positive ever again.
Terrific. Rami, I'm going to ask you one last question from me personally. I always think it's important to kind of have some background about the founder of a company and what inspired them to be a bot expert. So whatever you're feeling comfortable in sharing, can you kind of give us just a sort of summary of how you became an expert on bots?
You know, I had been in cloud security and cloud infrastructure for 10 years and working for large corporations, and I saw this as a gap. Initially, it was to help identify web scrapers, but as we were doing that, we saw this as a really big gap to identify the difference between a real person and a bot, and that's the premise of Distill. That's where we really came in on, and so that's really how I got started. I had an idea that I think this needed to be solved, and we set out to do it 4 years ago, and now 4 years later, we've grown to be a large company with dozens of Fortune 500 customers and hundreds of thousands of websites that we're protecting.
Terrific, good for you. Well, keep up the good work, you guys. You've always got friends with us. So thank you very, very much for sharing your expertise with the community. And Rami, we will be in touch soon, and we'll get you back on again soon for some updates.
Thanks so much, Mac.
Thanks. Have a good one, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye bye.